It was supposed to be one of those mornings that would quietly reshape the Middle East without most people even realizing it. According to the internal schedule, the United States military was prepared for a strike on Iran. The order existed. The forces were ready. Everything was positioned as if the next step was already decided. And yet, when the moment arrived, nothing happened. Not because of a public announcement, not because of a sudden diplomatic breakthrough, but because something far more unusual intervened at the highest level of global power. The attack was stopped. And it wasn't stopped by the usual mechanisms people assume control decisions like this. It wasn't Congress stepping in. It wasn't a court ruling. It wasn't a protest movement or a sudden change of strategy. Instead, 3 phone calls came in from 3 Gulf leaders: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And those calls changed everything in real time. What makes this moment even more striking is the contrast in timing. Just one day earlier, the tone was completely different. On Monday night, May 18, 2026, a message appeared from Donald Trump on Truth Social directed at Iran. The language was sharp, warning that time was running out, and that consequences would follow quickly if there was no movement. It framed the situation as urgent, almost irreversible, as if the machinery of action had already been set in motion. Then came Tuesday morning, May 19th, and the tone shifted completely. In a detailed post, Trump revealed something that changed the entire interpretation of what was happening behind the scenes. He stated that he had been contacted directly by the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. According to his message, these leaders had asked him to hold off on a planned military strike against Iran, which he described as scheduled for the following day. That detail alone changed the entire context. A military operation of this scale, apparently prepared without public knowledge, suddenly revealed to the world through a reversal in tone and timing. It suggested that decisions at the highest level had already moved far beyond public awareness before anyone outside a very small circle even knew it existed. The most important question emerging from this moment is not just what was planned, but what actually stopped it. Because the answer points to something deeper than diplomacy. It introduces a concept that is rarely discussed in public, but is central to understanding global power. The idea of a veto that is not written in law, but enforced through dependence. In international relations, a veto is usually formal. It exists in institutions like the United Nations Security Council, where certain countries have the power to block decisions legally. But what happened here appears different. It is what can be described as an informal veto, not granted by law, but by leverage. Not written in treaties, but embedded in infrastructure and dependency. This kind of veto becomes possible when a country's military operations rely heavily on the cooperation, territory, or political stability of other states. And in this case, that dependency runs through key Gulf locations that host major American military installations. Bases like Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, and Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia are not minor facilities. They are central nodes in the entire operational structure of the US. Power projection in the region. So the question becomes unavoidable. If those countries express opposition to a military strike, can those bases still function in the same way? Can an operation proceed normally if the very ground it relies on is politically withdrawn, even if not physically closed? That is where the concept of a veto becomes real, even without formal authority. Because in practice, if access, cooperation, or support is questioned, the operational ability to act begins to weaken immediately. And that is exactly what makes this moment so significant. Trump's decision did not emerge in isolation. It emerged in response to pressure from allies who are not usually seen as controllers of American military decisions. Yet in this case, their intervention appears to have shifted the outcome of a planned strike. And that raises a deeper question about how power actually flows in modern geopolitics, and who ultimately has influence over decisions that are assumed to be unilateral. And to understand why those calls were made at that exact moment, we need to look closely at what was happening inside those 3 countries, and why they would step into a situation of this magnitude. To understand why those 3 leaders intervened at that exact moment, it is necessary to look beyond the headlines and into the strategic pressure each of them was facing internally. Because none of these phone calls happened in isolation. Each one came from a different national calculation, but all of them pointed toward the same conclusion. Escalation at that moment carried risks they were not prepared to absorb. The first message came from Saudi Arabia, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi Arabia has positioned itself in recent years as a central player in both regional diplomacy and economic transformation. But behind that vision lies a very practical concern: stability. The Saudi economy is still heavily tied to oil markets, and any sudden military escalation involving Iran creates immediate volatility in energy prices and regional security. That volatility is not abstract. Every spike in oil prices creates short-term gains, but it also disrupts long-term planning, especially for Saudi Arabia's broader Vision 2030 economic diversification strategy. Stability is not just a preference, it is a requirement for that transition to succeed. A large-scale strike on Iran risks destabilizing that balance instantly. But there is another layer that matters even more. Saudi Arabia shares a direct regional environment with ongoing conflict dynamics, especially in Yemen. The Houthi movement has repeatedly demonstrated its ability to launch missile and drone attacks into Saudi territory. In previous escalations tied to Iran-aligned forces, Saudi infrastructure has already been targeted. From that perspective, a direct American strike on Iran is not just a distant geopolitical event. It is something that can immediately trigger retaliation pathways that loop back into Saudi territory. Missile exchanges, proxy escalation, and infrastructure risk are not theoretical outcomes. They are known patterns. So when MBS made that call, it was not only about diplomacy. It was about preventing an escalation chain that could directly impact Saudi land and economic stability. The second call came from Qatar, led by Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Qatar holds a very different but equally sensitive position. It hosts Al Udeid Air Base, one of the most important U.S. military installations in the entire Middle East. This base is not symbolic. It is operational headquarters for U.S. Central Command forward activities and hosts over 10,000 American personnel. At the same time, Qatar has built a carefully balanced diplomatic identity. It has acted as a mediator in multiple channels involving Iran, the United States, and other regional actors. Qatari diplomats have repeatedly moved between Tehran, Washington, and other regional capitals, carrying proposals and maintaining communication lines that other countries cannot easily sustain. An immediate military strike on Iran would collapse that entire structure. The neutrality Qatar has carefully cultivated would be questioned overnight. Its diplomatic usefulness would diminish, and its role as a mediator in regional negotiations could effectively disappear. For a small but strategically positioned state, that loss is significant. So when Qatar made its call, it was not simply asking for restraint. It was protecting its identity as a diplomatic bridge in a region defined by fragmentation. If that bridge is damaged, Qatar loses one of its most valuable geopolitical functions. The third call came from the United Arab Emirates, led by Mohammed bin Zayed. The UAE's position is perhaps the most complex of all. It is simultaneously engaged in regional normalization efforts, maintains security partnerships with Western allies, and has economic ties that require stability across the Gulf. But the immediate trigger in this case was recent vulnerability. Just days earlier, the UAE had experienced a direct strike on its nuclear infrastructure through a drone attack. That event alone shifted its threat perception significantly. It highlighted how quickly regional conflicts can move from proxy zones into direct exposure. At the same time, the UAE maintains a delicate balance between relationships with Israel, the United States, and Iran. That balance is extremely sensitive. A sudden escalation involving Iran would immediately place the UAE in a position where it could be seen as indirectly involved or aligned, increasing its exposure to retaliation. For Mohammed bin Zayed, the concern was not abstract future risk. It was immediate proximity to conflict dynamics that were already active. If a U.S. strike on Iran triggered retaliation cycles, the UAE could become one of the first regional states to absorb the consequences. So across all three calls, a pattern emerges. Different countries, different priorities, but the same underlying calculation. Escalation at that moment produced more risk than benefit. And importantly, all three had enough leverage through strategic cooperation and regional positioning to make their concerns matter. This is where the situation begins to shift from a simple diplomatic exchange into something structurally more significant. Because when multiple allied states simultaneously express opposition to a military action that is already scheduled, they are no longer just advising. They are influencing feasibility. And that leads directly into the deeper question of how much control the United States actually has over military operations that depend on a network of allied infrastructure, cooperation, and regional stability. At this point, the situation moves beyond individual phone calls and becomes a structural question about how modern military power actually functions. Because the United States does not operate in isolation in the Middle East. Its military presence is built on a network of bases, agreements, and regional partnerships that make large-scale operations possible in the first place. That network includes key installations spread across the Gulf. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar serves as a major operational hub, hosting forward elements of U.S. Central Command and supporting thousands of personnel. Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates plays a critical role in air operations, including support for advanced aircraft and strategic missions. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia provides additional logistical depth, missile defense systems, and troop presence that are essential for sustained regional operations. When you place these 3 points together, a clear reality emerges. These are not peripheral assets. They are central pillars of operational capacity. They enable refueling, coordination, intelligence sharing, air operations, and rapid deployment. Without them, the speed and scale of any major military action in the region changes significantly. Now consider the question raised by the events of that morning. If the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE express clear opposition to a planned military strike, what happens to the operational environment that depends on their cooperation? Not in theory, but in practice. Can aircraft still operate at full capacity from bases located in countries that are signaling resistance? Can command structures function smoothly if political support begins to shift, even informally? Can a strike maintain its original timing if logistical confidence is no longer guaranteed? This is where the concept of an informal veto becomes operational rather than theoretical. It is not a legal mechanism. It is not written into any treaty. Instead, it is rooted in dependency. When a military strategy relies on access, coordination, and host nation support, that support becomes a form of influence over decision-making itself. In this case, the intervention did not come through formal cancellation. It came through a change in conditions. And when conditions change at the level of infrastructure and alliance stability, military options are no longer purely unilateral. This is why the phrase, "the veto moved his hand," becomes more than rhetoric. It describes a situation where decision-making is shaped not only by intent, but by feasibility under real-world constraints. A planned strike may exist on paper, but if the environment supporting it becomes uncertain, the decision itself becomes unstable. Understanding this requires separating perception from operational reality. From the outside, it may appear that a single leader has full control over military action. But in practice, modern military operations depend on a layered system of cooperation. Intelligence sharing, airspace access, refueling rights, logistics hubs, and regional security guarantees all play a role in whether an operation can proceed smoothly. When key partners express concern, even without issuing formal prohibitions, they introduce uncertainty into that system. And uncertainty at that level can be enough to delay, revise, or suspend action. This is why the timing of the 3 phone calls matters so much. They did not happen days apart. They happened in a compressed window, Monday night into Tuesday morning, precisely as operational decisions were being finalized. That timing suggests urgency, not routine consultation. Each leader brought a different pressure point to the same conversation. Saudi Arabia brought regional retaliation, risk, and economic stability concerns. Qatar brought the integrity of its diplomatic mediation role and the operational reality of hosting a major U.S. command hub. The UAE brought immediate exposure due to recent attacks and its fragile balancing act between multiple regional actors. When combined, these pressures do not simply advise caution. They reshape the strategic environment in which the decision is being made. And this leads to a broader historical pattern, because this is not the first time American military planning has been affected by allied constraints. In fact, history shows multiple cases where coalition dynamics, rather than unilateral decisions, shaped or altered major U.S. military actions. To understand what happened that morning, it is necessary to place it within that historical pattern, where power is not only about capability, but about the network required to use that capability effectively. History provides an important lens for understanding what happened in this moment, because the idea of Allied influence shaping American military decisions is not new. What is often misunderstood is how frequently major U.S. operations have been adjusted, delayed, or even blocked not by adversaries, but by partners whose cooperation was essential to making those operations possible. One of the clearest examples comes from 1973, during the Yom Kippur War. At the time, Israel was engaged in a major conflict, and the United States moved to resupply its ally. But the situation escalated when Saudi Arabia, along with other Arab states, responded with an oil embargo. The impact was immediate and severe, driving global energy instability and creating economic pressure inside the United States itself. That crisis did not stop American policy through formal political channels. It stopped it through consequences. Rising fuel prices, supply disruptions, and domestic economic strain created a level of pressure that forced a strategic adjustment. It demonstrated a key reality. Even superpower decisions are vulnerable to systemic interdependence. A similar dynamic appeared in 1983 during the Lebanon intervention under President Ronald Reagan. After the bombing of the U.S. Marines barracks in Beirut, there was strong pressure to respond with increased military force. However, key coalition partners, including France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, signaled limits to their willingness to support escalation in the multinational force. Without unified coalition backing, the operation became politically and operationally constrained. Eventually, the United States withdrew its forces. Reagan did not reverse course because of a single directive from an adversary. The decision emerged from the collapse of coalition alignment, which made continued engagement strategically unsustainable. Then, in 2003, during the Iraq War, another constraint emerged, this time involving Turkey. The original U.S. war plan included a northern front that would pass through Turkish territory, allowing for a multi-directional invasion strategy. However, Turkey's parliament refused to approve the deployment of U.S. forces through its territory. This decision forced a major restructuring of the invasion plan. The northern front was effectively removed, altering the pace and structure of the entire campaign. What was expected to be a rapid, coordinated operation instead became a longer and more complex military engagement. The absence of one partner's approval reshaped the operational timeline of a major war. Across these examples, a consistent pattern becomes visible. Even when the United States possesses overwhelming military capability, the execution of that capability is still dependent on cooperation networks. Access, basing rights, logistical corridors, and coalition legitimacy all act as hidden variables that determine how freely that power can be used. Now, when placed alongside the events of 2026, the pattern becomes more significant. In each historical case, the constraint did come from formal enemies. It came from allies or partners whose participation or tolerance was essential to the operation. That is why the 3 phone calls from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE carry such weight. They do not represent isolated diplomatic advice. They represent a moment where multiple partners aligned their concerns at the exact point when a military decision was reaching its final stage. And unlike earlier historical cases, this intervention was not tied to parliamentary votes or long institutional processes. It happened in real time through direct executive communication during an active operational window. This compresses the timeline of influence dramatically. Instead of weeks or months of diplomatic negotiation, the constraint appeared within hours, directly intersecting with the decision-making cycle. The implication is not that American power is diminished in absolute terms. The United States still maintains unmatched military capability. The implication is that the conditions under which that capability can be deployed are shaped by a dense web of relationships that cannot be ignored. And this brings us back to the key idea emerging from this event. Power in the modern system is not only about strength, but about alignment. When alignment shifts, even slightly, it can reshape what is possible in practice, regardless of what is possible in theory. That sets the stage for the deeper structural question revealed by this morning's events. If allied states can influence the timing and feasibility of military action, what does that mean for the balance of power going forward? And how is that balance now being redefined in real time? To understand what this morning actually revealed, it is not enough to look at it as a single incident. It has to be understood as part of a larger structural shift in how power is distributed and exercised in the Middle East. Because beneath the surface of a postponed military strike, something more fundamental was exposed. The way dependence shapes freedom of action. The United States has long provided the security backbone for much of the Gulf region. American forces are stationed across key bases. American air power supports regional deterrence, and American naval presence helps stabilize critical shipping routes. In the traditional model, the relationship is clear. The United States provides security guarantees, and Gulf states provide strategic access, infrastructure, and cooperation. That model has defined regional order for decades. But what happened this morning suggests a subtle inversion of that relationship. The same states that rely on American protection also demonstrated that they can influence the conditions under which that protection is used offensively. This is the key tension. If Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE can meaningfully raise concerns that alter the timing or feasibility of a U.S. military strike, then their role is no longer passive. It becomes structurally influential, not through formal authority, but through embedded necessity. This does not mean they control American policy in a direct sense. Instead, it means they occupy a position within the system where their cooperation is part of what makes action possible. And when cooperation becomes conditional, it creates leverage. From a strategic standpoint, this creates a feedback loop. The United States relies on Gulf infrastructure to project power. The Gulf states rely on the United States for security guarantees. But at moments of high tension, each side becomes aware of the other's dependency in a very direct way. That awareness is what produces influence in real time. It is not written in treaties or announced in press conferences. It emerges during crisis moments when decisions are being finalized and risks are being recalculated under pressure. This is why the three calls matter beyond their immediate content. They represent a coordinated signal that escalation at that specific moment would disrupt regional stability in ways that even close partners were not willing to absorb. And importantly, this signal was not directed at Iran. It was directed at Washington. That alone changes the dynamic because it means that the internal decision space of American military planning is not isolated from allied regional calculations. Once that becomes visible, it reshapes how every actor interprets future behavior. It also introduces a new layer of strategic calculation for Iran. From Tehran's perspective, the morning unfolded in a very different way. Instead of seeing a unilateral American strike proceed, Iranian leadership observed something more significant. Key U.S. partners actively intervening to prevent escalation, not necessarily in defense of Iran, but in defense of stability. The practical outcome, however, was the same. A planned strike did not occur. That observation carries strategic weight. It suggests that escalation is not automatic. It suggests that there are multiple points of friction within the system that can slow or redirect action. And it suggests that regional actors are not aligned in a simple binary structure of opposition and support, but in a more complex balance of risk management. This is where leverage begins to shift. If Iran interprets this moment correctly, It sees that pressure does not only come from Washington, it also comes from within Washington's network of partners. And that network has its own thresholds for acceptable risk. At the same time, Gulf states are also recalibrating. By intervening successfully, they have demonstrated that their concerns can influence outcomes at the highest level. But this also creates a responsibility. If they intervene once, expectations for future intervention increase. If they fail to intervene later, they risk losing credibility as stabilizing actors. So the system becomes more sensitive, not less. Each actor now understands more clearly where pressure points exist, and that awareness changes future behavior. This is why the concept of a veto, even an informal one, becomes so important. It is not a fixed power. It is a situational influence that depends on timing, alignment, and urgency. And once it is demonstrated, it becomes part of the strategic environment going forward, which leads directly into the final layer of analysis. What this means for future decisions, and how this morning may have already set the conditions for what happens next in the region.